Hi, everybody. My name is Maria Borrell. I'm with the Senior Vice President for Disaster Operations, CCUSA. With me is Simona Wright-James of my staff and Fanny Cruz, and they are helping us see this webinar. So thank you to Simona and Fanny for doing your helping in this. I'm really so glad you're able to participate in today's webinar. I'm hoping that you're going to find this to be just a really grounding presentation to help think through how we're looking at disasters. Let me just start with a little bit of housekeeping. If you can go to the next slide. So by now, you all should have not only gotten into GoToWebinar, but also done the audio link. And you can do that two ways. One is through your computer, using your computer's mic and speakers. The other is through your telephone. And what's on the screen right now are the numbers for you to use to get in from an audio standpoint as well. During the webinar, if you have some questions that you'd like to ask our speaker, you can write them in the box on the right-hand side in the chat box area. At the end of the webinar, we are going to, right now all of the phones are muted through the system, and so at the end of Kathleen's presentation, we're going to go in the order in which you write questions, and we'll open your mic for you to ask the question that you've written in. And so feel free as the questions come to you to just type this in, and then we'll be having a question and answer session at the end. For your information also, we are recording this webinar, and it will be located on our members page. You also should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen a PDF, and that's the PDF of the slides that Kathleen is going to use. You can download that and print them out and use them to take notes, and so that's another tool for your reference. So next slide, please. Let's look at the agenda. Here we are. So what we're going to be talking about today is really some real basic information on what is disaster vulnerability. I know that you all are working with vulnerable populations day in and day out. Today's webinar is to take a look at what constitutes disaster vulnerability from a variety of factors, and what makes people more vulnerable to disaster than others. We're also going to briefly discuss how do the current disaster relief and recovery policies serve the needs of the people that we care about the most, our vulnerable populations. And Kathleen is going to share with us some insights from relevant disaster research. And then we'll conclude with a discussion around what can be done to better serve vulnerable populations post-disaster. So let me introduce you to our speaker. I'm really honored to be able to introduce you to Dr. Kathleen Tyranny. In front of you, you have just some of her official credentials and some of her accomplishments. But allow me to expand for a moment. I've known and worked with Kathleen for 20 years. And in the world of academic research, there's a subfield of disaster sociology in which Kathleen is recognized as a national expert. She's been the director of 2 of the leading disaster research centers in the country, the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, and also the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado in Boulder. One of the things that I appreciate about Kathleen, that in addition to exacting very high standards of research for herself and the disaster researchers across the country, Kathleen has been a real partner with federal, state, and local emergency managers to help in the collaboration of applying research to the real world. And the dialogue that she's fostered over a lifetime of work between practitioners and the academicians has really helped to advance the field of emergency management for all of us. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Kathleen for her presentation, and then I look forward to hearing your questions following her remarks. Okay, Kathleen, if you can take control of the presentation.
Okay. What I'm going to be talking about with you today. And let me say, first of all, that it's a real honor and pleasure to be here talking to so many of you from around the country. What I'm going to be talking about is the concept of disaster vulnerability. And as Maria said, you all work with vulnerable populations on a daily basis. And I want to talk about that in the context of disasters. So when I'm talking about vulnerability, I'm talking about people's potential for experiencing negative impacts as a result of any type of disaster, including dying, being injured, having negative mental health impacts, having to be out of their homes, suffering economic losses, and having difficulties after disaster in terms of being able to recover. And when we, in the disaster world, talk about vulnerability, we look at it as being the result or the outcome of 4 sets of factors. What is referred to as the hazardousness of place, ecological and environmental factors, built environment vulnerability, and finally, what I'm going to be emphasizing probably the most, socially structured population, group, and community characteristics that lead to social vulnerability. So let me talk first about hazardousness of place. A lot of time is spent on understanding the disaster history of regions around the country and mapping physical vulnerabilities. And here we have a map of earthquake hazards in the U.S. and a map of historic wildfire activity between 1994 and 2013. And you can see here that the hazardousness of place for earthquakes is centered in California, the Pacific Northwest, but you also notice even places like Charleston, South Carolina, and the central U.S., the New Madrid Fault Zone, are places where the earthquake risk is high or moderate. Wildfires, so far, as we've experienced historically, are generally Western phenomena, right, in the American West. That's where we have the highest hazardousness of place for that particular hazard. If we look at a map combining earthquake, flood, hurricane, and tornado hazards, we see that probably the safest place to be is in parts of northern Ohio and Michigan, just about in parts of Texas. Almost every place else has some kind of hazard, with hurricane hazards on the east and Gulf Coast being very prominent. So we refer to this as being exposed to a particular hazard by virtue simply of where you live. The environment and ecological systems can also be sources of disaster vulnerability. I know that we have some folks from Louisiana on the webinar today, and we certainly heard a lot about the depletion of wetlands in Louisiana and how that played into the intensity of Hurricane Katrina and the damages that were caused. So when actions are taken that result in the loss of natural protections against disasters, we have heightened vulnerability. Similarly, we all know about the role of climate change, sea level rise, in increasing disaster vulnerability. This was certainly a factor in many recent disasters, including Superstorm Sandy, land subsidence as well, can expose populations and communities to hazards in ways that they weren't exposed before. So we have to look at the environmental and ecological contribution to disaster vulnerability, which changes over time and therefore changes the vulnerability of exposed populations. The built environment includes residential and commercial buildings and infrastructure such as highways, bridges, dams, levees, etc. And just looking at buildings, we see that buildings can be vulnerable for a range of reasons. They might be very old buildings, not built to current codes. They might be poorly maintained, and we know that many vulnerable people are living in old and substandard buildings. Our codes, our building codes, change over time. The vast majority of existing buildings in the United States have been built following outdated building codes. So we know much more, for example, about how to make buildings earthquake resistant now than we knew in the 30s, the 50s, the 70s, and the 90s. But much of the existing building stock was built during those times. You can have situations where building designs are inappropriate and don't take hazards into account. You have situations where building codes are not adopted at the community level. Many states also frown on certain types of building codes. Memphis, Tennessee, for example, is in the New Madrid fault zone and would be affected by an earthquake, and very seriously affected, as a matter of fact, by an earthquake in the New Madrid fault zone. But the city of Memphis has not adopted seismic codes. This comes up periodically, and it's always voted down. There are also situations where there are building codes on the books, but they're not enforced, or building and safety departments don't do a good job of inspecting buildings when they're being constructed. If we look, for example, at relatively recent hurricanes in Florida, we see hurricane damage in relatively new residential structures, and when it's looked into more carefully, what is found is that the inspection practices were inadequate in terms of looking at how those homes and other buildings were actually constructed. Here are some examples that we can talk about related to built environment. Of course, the levees in Hurricane Katrina were breached. This caused the massive flooding and the massive loss of life. Subsequent studies on the levees concluded that these levees it was a system of levees in name only, and that there were institutional factors, legal factors, etc., that contributed to the vulnerability of these levees and to the losses in Katrina. On the other side, you see photographs of two types of poor building designs. And I want to call your attention to that bottom photograph, which shows both an old building and one that was not designed to resist earthquake forces. What you see in this photograph of this big apartment building is what engineers call a soft story, a first floor that lacks resistance to earthquake forces and causes extensive building damage and in many cases building collapse. And what you see in the upper photo is an example of a typical Southern California apartment building and the kind of damage that was seen in the Northridge earthquake in 1994. Again, weak lower stories causing the building to collapse. Who is likely to live in some of these old collapse hazard buildings? Low-income people, members of minorities, people with other types of forms of vulnerability. And then finally we come to the social vulnerability dimension, which I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with. Here we're looking at the way that characteristics of populations and groups mean that they don't have access to safe places to live, that they have difficulty mitigating and preparing for disasters and undertaking protective measures. Lots of people have many more everyday crises on their minds and really don't have the bandwidth to start thinking about disasters. There are marginalized groups, people who are living in poverty who suffer disproportionate losses in disasters and lack the resilience to recover. The upper photo here is a picture of a mobile home park that was struck by a tornado. And as you know, manufactured housing is a source of a place to live for many elderly people, for many low-income people, for many members of minority groups. But this is a highly vulnerable type of housing. Just one statistic, manufactured housing comprises about 7.5% of all the housing in the United States. But between 1985 and 2007, 43% of all tornado fatalities occurred in manufactured housing. So 7.5% of all the housing units in the country, 43% of the fatalities. The risk of dying if you're in living in manufactured housing is 10 times higher than other kinds of housing. And we also see that fatalities occur in less powerful tornadoes than you would expect in other types of housing. So this form of housing is extremely hazardous. The lower photograph is one that you may have seen from Hurricane Katrina. The point here being that it was people who were reliant on public transportation, who didn't have a way of getting out of New Orleans, who probably couldn't afford to stay in a hotel, maybe couldn't even afford gas money if they had a car, or had other reasons for having to remain in New Orleans, such as jobs that they wouldn't get paid if they didn't show up for the job, and so forth. These were the people that were most at risk of dying. So again, social vulnerability refers to the extent to which people are able to take advantage of mitigation measures and other self-protective measures. The research that's been done over decades shows that social vulnerability is influenced by income, by migration patterns, people moving into more hazardous areas, for example, moving to coastal areas. It's influenced by access to self-protective options, by age, by disability, by minority group status, and by social capital. There is a lot of recent research that points to the importance of social capital, embeddedness in your community, the social networks that you belong to, the organizations that you belong to, how tightly cohesive your neighborhood is. Things like that as being, social capital as being an important buffer against disaster, vulnerability, and loss. Again, at the individual level, research has talked about gender as a social vulnerability factor, race, social class, ethnicity, disability, age, access to political power and political influence, citizenship status, and language and communication ability. These are some individual level vulnerability factors. And many folks, as you know, and no doubt many of the people that you work with, are vulnerable along multiple of these dimensions, not just one or two. We saw the role that poverty plays in being a disaster victim in Hurricane Katrina, certainly. I'd like to turn next, though, to talking about how well our disaster policies and programs serve the most vulnerable. My first point here has to do with citizenship and eligibility for disaster aid. The non-citizens are not eligible for any federal disaster assistance programs other than immediate, expedient emergency shelter. After that, at least one member of a household has to be a U.S. citizen in order to be able to access federal disaster relief programs. Now, there may be local programs, state programs, and of course programs operated by agencies like Catholic Charities that do help undocumented people, but the major sources of federal aid are closed off to them. And, you know, not only that, but people who are undocumented or can't produce the kinds of documents that would prove that they're in the country legally often stay away from applying for aid because they're afraid that this is going to get them into trouble, that they're going to be deported, and so forth. So citizenship is very important when we're talking about a wide range of disaster aid entitlements. Then there's the issue of housing, and especially rental housing. Now, if you're living in a substandard dwelling, say an apartment building, that apartment building isn't going to fare well in, say, a hurricane or an earthquake. And so people who live in substandard housing, who are generally low-income people, are more likely to be displaced. Renters also are dependent on their landlords to make rental units livable after disaster. So there's very little that you can do as a renter to replace the roof of the apartment building that you're living in. That's up to the landlord to do. But if that is a building that hasn't been well maintained, that is substandard, that landlord isn't going to get assistance from FEMA to bring that building up to a better code or to make it more livable, because FEMA doesn't compensate building owners for pre-existing conditions. If you have an old building, a poorly maintained building, you know, you're not going to be able as a landlord to get assistance to make that a really great building. And if you decide to make it a really great building yourself as a landlord, what you're going to do is raise the rent. And then at that point, maybe your tenants can't afford to live there anymore. And this certainly happened to us here in Colorado after the 2013 floods. landlords fix their buildings and then they raise the rent. Even one of my graduate students and her partner had to move out of where they were living because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. If you're a homeowner, you have to be able to document the fact that you do legally and clearly own the home. But that can be difficult in some cases, and particularly in the South and in coastal areas in the Gulf region, there is this phenomenon of heir property where a house has been, or home, or a piece of land even, has been handed down in the family informally for generations, but there's no proof that the person living there actually does own the home. This first came to my attention after Hurricane Hugo in 1989, particularly in South Carolina and in some of the barrier islands, where traditionally property had simply been handed down. So you got to prove that you own the home in order to get the federal assistance. Further, there is this head of household issue. Federal aid is based on the idea that there's one household living in one home or one apartment or one mobile home, and that there is one quote-unquote head of household. But you have, and we increasingly have, the situation where low-income families are doubling up because that's the only way that they can afford to live and to make the rent, where there may be two heads of households in one dwelling, or there may be living arrangements where you have a group of unrelated people living together, right, who are displaced. Who's the head of household? So I'm going to make this point again a little more strongly in a few minutes, but you know, federal disaster aid is based on the idea of the one nuclear family with mom, dad, and the kids. I mean, that's basically it. Also, after a disaster, when you're out of your house, you may qualify for rental assistance, rental house vouchers, or you may be put up in a hotel with federal assistance. But that place may turn out to be far from your job, far from where you were living before, far from your friends, and for a lot of people, that's a real hardship. Here, again, in the 2013 floods, we had many university students who were living around the campus, who were displaced to other communities that were far away. And again, the hardship for a working person involved in living far from their job is a considerable hardship for many people. But you don't have any control over that, particularly if a lot of the housing stock in your community is damaged in a disaster. You may be displaced far away from the people that you know and from your daily routines. What we've learned looking at disaster assistance and disaster aid programs, we've learned that there's a certain cultural competence that comes into play in dealing with the disaster assistance system. And I just listed a few things here, right? You have to know that aid's available. You have to know how to access it. It really helps if you speak English. It helps if you've been keeping good records, right? That you know, you have the deed to your house, you have your birth certificate, you have all these different kinds of things that prove that you're eligible. You have to be comfortable with bureaucracy. You have to invest the time and effort in getting disaster assistance. Yes, you can apply for some forms of assistance online, but that's not the easiest process for a lot of people doing stuff online. You have to be able to navigate forms. You have to understand that you can appeal decisions and ask for more aid or get an agency to overturn a decision. So I'm just asking here, who's most likely to have these kinds of skill sets? Probably not a really elderly person, not somebody of below average intelligence, probably, not somebody with a mental health problem, not an immigrant who doesn't maybe even understand our disaster assistance system, maybe is not very conversant in English. So a lot of barriers exist to vulnerable populations getting assistance after disasters, even very badly needed assistance. So there's this concept that you've probably heard of in the social sciences called the Matthew effect. And that comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and it comes from many other writings in the Bible about the fact that those who have get, and those who don't have not only don't get, but may lose the little bit that they have. You know, and I think the Matthew effect is often at work in the disaster aid process, where those who have the best chance of receiving aid and recovery are those who already have a lot going for them. So a homeowner that has equity in their home and has good credit and access to savings and so forth is likely to do quite well if that homeowner needs disaster assistance. Not so for many other people. And many of you who haven't gone through disasters are probably not aware that the primary form of large amounts or substantial amounts of federal aid comes in the form of loans. That in order to get those loans, you have to have a good credit record, just like you would have to have if you went to a bank. But 1 in 10 adults in the United States have no credit at all. And it's 9% for whites and 15% for African American and Hispanics in the United States. So not having credit, big problem. 8% of the population qualifies as being unbanked. That means they don't have a checking account, a savings account, a money market account, and the highest rates of being unbanked are among non-Asian minorities. And this will again come into play when a person goes in to deal with the disaster assistance bureaucracy. Almost a quarter of our population doesn't have a credit card. Again, they just don't have access to credit, which will influence not only their ability to use credit in the aftermath of a disaster, but also to get disaster aid. And then you have the issue of home ownership, with 73% of the white population owning homes, as compared with 47% of Hispanics and 45% of African Americans. So almost half of all Hispanics and African Americans are renters. Again, a vulnerable population when you think about the dependence on landlords to maintain dwellings and to make repairs after disasters. Home ownership also qualifies you for assistance in home repairs. For example, after the 2013 floods, my house was flooded. I had over 2 feet of water in my finished basement. My insurance, I didn't have flood insurance because I wasn't in a floodplain. My insurance for water backup was capped, and I had to go and get a Small Business Administration home loan to make my home repairs, as well as using savings, which I was fortunate to have. Other current realities, the typical Caucasian household has 16 times the wealth of the typical African American household, and having wealth is very important if you're thinking about recovering from a disaster, being able to tap into that savings, sell some of your stocks if you own stocks, and so forth to try to make yourself whole again after a disaster. And African Americans are more subject than Caucasians in the United States to predatory lending. We certainly did see this after the 2008 financial meltdown. This damages their credit, and they're also discriminated against in terms of loan amounts and loan conditions. I was involved in a study after the 1987 Whittier Narrows earthquake, where we looked at 4 different communities that were affected by the earthquake. One was majority white, one was majority Asian, one was majority African American, one was majority Hispanic. The decisions about business loans that were made to business owners to repair their businesses followed directly racial lines, with the majority white community being much more likely to get loans, to get favorable loan terms than businesses in those other communities. So you even see a type of bias in federal business loan programs. And so all of these combined disadvantages can affect people's access to assistance. Just want to briefly talk about what we've learned. I'm just going to talk about 4 insights. I could list 40 or possibly even 400. That minority-owned businesses are more likely to have difficulty recovering after disasters, that minority communities and minority business owners are disadvantaged in the loan process. I just made that point. That if we look at disasters like Hurricane Katrina, there were differential rates of return to the city of New Orleans based on race, and that for those who did return, being able to recover your income was more difficult for African American women than for other women. So here we see an example of intersectionality, right? The intersection of gender and race being important in terms of recovery outcomes. So I want to end by talking about what we can do to help members of vulnerable groups recover after disasters. And my first point is that assisting people with recovery doesn't start after a disaster. It starts before, by systematically looking at the vulnerabilities in a community, those vulnerabilities being hazardousness of place, environmental vulnerability, built environment vulnerability, and social vulnerability. And my colleague Susan Cutter at the University of South Carolina has developed a social vulnerability index for every county in the United States. And it can also be looked at the city level as well. So understanding all those different forms of vulnerability and identifying who's vulnerable is very important. I think that the nonprofit sector really has a role to play in working with organizations in our communities that focus on disaster risk reduction. Often those linkages are not made, or the nonprofits that are working with disaster management agencies are those whose roles are disaster specific. Everybody who deals with vulnerable populations should be working more closely with their local disaster management agencies. There ought to be coalitions formed of nonprofits to support community efforts to reduce different types of vulnerability. This is an important thing that nonprofits can do for their clients that their clients aren't able to do for themselves. And in working with the nonprofit sector, I would encourage you to encourage them to start thinking more about the disaster-related needs of the vulnerable groups that they serve. Relative to this, a few years ago, my center was involved in doing research on nonprofits that serve highly vulnerable populations in the city and county of San Francisco. And we found some very interesting things. We found that that these agencies themselves were likely to be victims in disasters because they tended to be located in older buildings that were vulnerable, for example, to earthquakes, and that they weren't particularly well connected to the disaster risk management sector in San Francisco City and County. These were organizations that form the social safety net for the most vulnerable people, the deinstitutionalized mentally ill people, immigrants, people who needed food, so the food pantries and so forth. We referred to this set of organizations as the critical civic infrastructure that needs to function after disasters to be able to be there for their clients. And we found that a lot of work needs to be done in that area. So, you know, I would definitely encourage all of you from Catholic Charities to start working, if you're not doing it already, with emergency management agencies and forming coalitions and networks to start talking about what you would do for your clients in the aftermath of a disaster. And disasters are terrible things, but they also open windows of opportunity for bringing things on the community agenda that need to be addressed. Issues like safe and affordable housing, for example. So you should prepare to take advantage of funding opportunities and other things that are going to be going on after disaster to advocate for the people that you serve. So I'm finished talking, and now we can open it up for questions or comments. If anybody would like to share their own experiences, I think that would be great.
All right, excellent. So we'll go ahead now and turn it toward the questions that were posed and open the line for those individuals that did have questions. So the first question comes from Zach. His question is that he's interested in learning more about emerging best practices around effectively engaging those who may be of limited English proficiency in disaster preparedness, response, and or recovery. He is asking if you have any thoughts or advice as it relates to that. And I'll now go ahead and open his line so you all can discuss that.
Yes, I think this is really important, and it points to the need for culturally competent and culturally sensitive community outreach programs. You know, the average American born in the United States doesn't know, and speaking English, doesn't know a whole lot about the disaster risk management and disaster assistance world. Why would they? For most people, being in a disaster or facing a hazard is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But if you look at, you know, recent immigrants from other countries who are perhaps refugees, who come from other types of societies, they may have not even any awareness of the kinds of hazards that they're facing in their new communities, in their new life. And we need people from those communities who speak those languages and folks to work with them to go to the places where people gather, to go to the community centers, to go to clubs, to go to even bars, right? To meet people where they're at and speak to them in a language and a way of relating that they can understand.
All right, and thank you so much for responding to that question. And Zach, it's definitely, if you had a follow-up, your mic is open, just so you know. All right, so we'll move on to the next question. All righty, 1 second. All right, thank you for bearing with me. The next question was from Scott Stevens. He had a question as it relates to the Hispanic higher home ownership. He says, so Hispanics have higher home ownership than African Americans. Is this based on socioeconomic situation, or are there several families coming together to purchase and live in a home?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that question, but as a sociologist, I would say that probably both. You know, multi-generational households, for example, people may be pooling their resources. It could also have something to do with housing prices in areas where these populations live. I'm just really not sure. I'd like to look into it, though.
And Scott, again, your line is open, so if you have any further question or comment, now is a good time to do that. All right. We're going to move forward to the next question. Thank you. Name of this person. The next question was posed from Glenn Leach. And Glenn, I'm now opening your mic. So after I state your question, if you have any other further comments, you'll be able to to voice those. All right. So Glenn's question is the other than today's excellent comments, there needs to be a listing of ways in which vulnerable communities, age, immigrant, poor, etc., to speed up thinking about remedial measures. Also as it relates to awareness materials, thought starters for use of out of work and with emergency managers. And please, Glenn, clarify anything that I stated in case I'm not.
Thank you, Fanny. all that I was asking is there already, in addition to what we heard today, a compilation of risk factors and special vulnerabilities for vulnerable populations that's already been compiled to give us a kickstart on local work with community with county emergency managers and others?
Yeah, there are lots of compilations of, there's a really interesting book published by CRC Press called Social Vulnerability to Disasters. That's Social Vulnerability to Disasters. And the book is full of discussions of various kinds of vulnerability factors, as well as suggestions about what to do.
Great, thank you.
So I think that's a very important book. I'm not supposed to plug my own book, The Social Roots of Risk, but I also talk a lot in there about resilience and give some examples of vulnerable communities who have managed to be very resilient in the aftermath of disasters through building social capital, through political activism, getting their communities on the public agenda when they weren't before, who have fared well after disasters through building bonds and social ties with other vulnerable groups. So we need to keep in mind that vulnerability represents the potential for loss, but vulnerable communities can also be resilient, very resilient. They have to be. On a day-to-day basis, they have to be.
Glenn and everybody else on the line, when we send out, at the end of this presentation, I'll send out the 2 books that Kathleen just referenced for your use. But also, if you want to send me an email, my staff and I would be happy to talk one-on-one with some social vulnerability index resources that are out there that also can help you plot where you have social vulnerable populations in your diocese.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute at the University of South Carolina, these are the people that put together the Social Vulnerability Index. And you can go and look at vulnerability scores county by county, and I don't think you'll be surprised at where some of the social vulnerabilities lie.
All right, excellent. Moving forward to the next question posed by Laura Jenkins. I'm now going to open your line, Laura. Your question. All right, so Laura posed the question, is how can vulnerabilities be addressed post-disaster?
Post-disaster. Well, I think that it's, as I said, it's a very good idea to figure out who are the vulnerable people before disaster. Where is it that they're living? What kind of housing are they living in? Where are they likely to be sheltered after a disaster? This involves a whole variety of things. It could range from providing translation services at disaster application centers for people to helping them understand what kind of documentation, what kind of information they're going to need in order to be able to qualify for assistance. It could involve advocacy on behalf of groups who are being overlooked. Often what we see also is that there are close-knit communities that the whole community gets displaced and dispersed, helping people reconnect, doing a lot of outreach work to find out how those folks are faring during the recovery period. Maria, what else? I know that you can get in on this too. Any ideas?
Yeah, I'm right here. So thank you, Kathleen. I mean, one of the first steps, in my opinion, is to actually do outreach to your vulnerable populations to see what their needs are, as opposed to waiting for them to find you. So to take a proactive stance. So to Kathleen's point, knowing where the populations are that are at risk, and also knowing where the natural hazards are in your community. There may be one side of town that's worse than the other, for instance, and so you prioritize high risk and vulnerable, and to go out there and physically see how they're doing and to start a conversation. If you can be escorted by somebody of the demographic that you are engaging with, that also increases your effectiveness. And so the start of that is to do an assessment of what is the nature of the impact, and then using the resources of your agency to start building bridges and finding solutions based on what their needs are. I mean, that's just a really general answer, but one of the things that sometimes all it takes is to use, to personally put yourself into the community to assess the impact and start finding solutions that are collaborative, that are coming from the community that you're trying to serve. Do we have any answers?
Definitely.
Okay. So, go ahead.
So at this time, we don't have any other questions, but we do want to open up the line for anyone that has a comment. So if you have a comment, there is an icon on your screen that looks like a little hand. Just go ahead and click that icon indicating that you do have a comment, and I can open your line.
Yeah, I'd really love to hear your comments, and I'm sure other people on the line would too.
Kind of awkward to have a conversation on a webinar, and so we're not seeing any hands being raised at this point. I'll just give it another minute. And any questions, any comments?
About what you've seen in disasters in your community, what you've seen with your clients or other vulnerable populations?
All right, it looks like we do have one other question posed by Carrie Allman. I'll go ahead and open your line, Corey.
And while Simona is opening that line, the question is, how do we determine the relative vulnerability of a county where we work?
Well, your local emergency management agency will have done a hazard assessment, which will include information about the hazards to which the county is exposed. It is also very likely that there will be a hazardous building inventory of some sort. FEMA has software that's called HAZUS, H-A-Z-U-S, all capital letters, that includes for communities assessments of the building stock, as well as assessments of vulnerable populations and populations that are most likely to be displaced. A meeting with the local emergency management agency would put you in contact with a lot of different resources. Census data will tell you about substandard housing. The housing census will tell you about population composition. You can also use other data, such as data from the other federal government data, to look at not only the demographics of the population, but also rates of disability. A long time ago, I was involved in a study in Los Angeles where we merged hazardous building data with data on disabled populations in different census tracts, and found out, lo and behold, that people with disabilities were more likely to be living in older hazardous buildings. This was in the early days of GIS. Now it's much easier to do that sort of thing, to look and see, you know, where are the census tracts with the bad housing, where are the census tracts with people with disability, where are members of the aged population living, and so forth. And again, your local emergency management agency might have just exactly that kind of data.
So to follow up, this is Maria. To follow up with what Kathleen just said, I highly encourage you, if you haven't started working with local emergency management, to do so, and also give our office a call, and we can also help you with access to some of the data that Kathleen is referencing. Let me open the phone line now to Julianne.
Yes. We have 3 more questions being posed. I'm opening Julianne's line now. And Julianne, I understand that you weren't able to raise your hand, so your line is open if you want to go ahead and pose your question.
Yeah,
or comment.
Thank you. This is Julianne from Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of New York.
Aha.
Hi.
Yes.
And in my experience, I don't think we've done a very good job of reducing disaster risk. I think we are very reactionary. We have a lot of programs after the fact, but we don't really do a lot before to determine who those vulnerable populations are, even though we probably know them already, and to actually take strategies to help reduce their risk. So are there maybe good examples of risk reduction strategies in other areas that we could build upon?
Yes, but I just want to say something about, I want to react to the comment that you just made. When we interviewed almost 100 nonprofits that serve vulnerable populations in San Francisco, and again, we found their disaster planning to be pretty minimal. Many of their disaster plans just included information on how they would evacuate the building in the event of an earthquake or a fire, not much else. And we asked them why, and their answers were very enlightening. They said, we're overwhelmed already with serving our clients. We're completely overwhelmed. That was one thing. Another thing is nobody's requiring us to do it. Our funders don't require it, and we're barely scraping by on our budget with the things that we have to do, that we're required to do. And another thing was, we don't have the technical expertise to do this, right? We don't understand the problem well enough. You know, so I think there are good reasons why the nonprofit sector doesn't pay as much attention as it should to disasters. I mean, you guys are overwhelmed as it is. I think that that there has been some effort to set up standards for nonprofits for disaster preparedness. I can look for those standards and send them to Maria. I don't have them at hand right now. I think that that is anybody here from California, from the Bay Area? Because in the Bay Area, there's an organization called CARD, C-A-R-D, and that stands for Collaborative Agencies Responding to Disasters. It's an effort, it's a coalition, an effort to try to get nonprofits all on the same page about best practices and how they're going to be doing their outreach in communities and so forth. So one really nice effort would be to compile some resources for you guys. And I can look into doing that.
That would be awesome.
But,
Julianne, did you have anything else you wanted to ask?
That was the major question. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Great, excellent. So we have quite a few more questions that kind of are rolling in now at this point. So I'll go ahead and unmute all those individuals who did pose a question. So up next will be questions from Aaron, John, Jessica, as well as Colleen. So just be mindful that I'm going to unmute your lines and you can pose your question.
So you're going to tell them when they're unmuted?
Yeah. I'm unmuting all of you now, so you can.
So Aaron, you're unmuted. Aaron.
Mine was more of a, are you there? Can you hear this?
We can.
Okay. Mine was more of a comment. Each state should have a voluntary organizations active in disaster network, VOAD. I'm fortunate enough to be the current chair in Ohio, but we've been working with, first on the county, and now on the state level, they've started to recognize the importance of having faith-based communities and their agencies involved in the planning, the exercises, and then the response whenever something horrible does happen. And so if there's any way within your state you can connect with that network and encourage them to, well, it took several years of really pushing the fact that we are force multipliers in the faith community, then that absolutely makes sense. It also, we can be a resource, the network is a resource for agencies who have people who are vulnerable. I mean, we cut down trees for our social service agency this year just because they had a couple that couldn't afford to do it. I mean, it's well beyond just disaster efforts. So I think everybody needs to realize what a force we can be to help and to actually do some of the pre-planning. I just wanted to make that comment. Bless your hearts for this.
Aaron, thank you. I was just about to mention the VOADs, yes. So thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
All right, up next, we're going to go to Colleen Smith. All right, Colleen, your line is open so you can pose your question.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, Colleen Smythe from Catholic Charities of St. Louis in Missouri. And my question is, what incentives can be created to motivate legislators to put disaster preparedness and resiliency on their agendas?
Well, unfortunately, the biggest incentive turns out to be experiencing a disaster.
Okay.
But you know, other incentives include things like votes and public recognition. You know, create an award for a city council member who champions disasters. Form coalitions. Take advantage of disasters that happen in other communities to say, hey, St. Louis, look at what just happened in Des Moines, right? Look at the big flood that Des Moines had. We have a big potential for having the same thing here. What are you doing about it? Again, working with the local emergency management to find out what sorts of issues they've identified, and is there something that could perhaps take the form of an ordinance.
The other thing, this is Maria, that you know, your local FEMA office would be able to tell you a return on investment. Missouri's had so much flooding. There's actually a lot of data on the dollars saved from future flooding based on mitigation that Missouri has already done.
Yeah, or look at a city like Tulsa. Other incentives, you know, in terms of floods, there is the community rating system, which many communities participate in who have a flood hazard. And, you know, the more the community does to reduce their hazards, the lower the premiums are for the residents that have flood insurance. So that's an incentive right there.
All right, excellent. So the next question comes from John Machado. Your line is open so you can pose your question. All right. So I'll go ahead and pose John's question on his behalf. It states, all of the vulnerabilities mentioned in your presentation are issues we address in our financial coaching program. So this is more a comment saying thank you for your expertise. We will begin to incorporate disaster preparation into their existing program. And he said good place to gather data. So again, thank you. We're going to now move forward to the next question posed from Jessica Watson. Jessica, I'll go ahead and open your line so you can pose your question. Jessica? Okay. It sounds like we have a bad signal from Jessica. Again, I'll go ahead and just pose her question. Can you have a list of these resources on your website? Also, maybe you should let people know about the what you did, the co-ed and BOED organizations that exist, and how to join them and participate in them.
Yeah, so thank you, Jessica. This is Maria. We'll take that in our development of our resources for our members page on disaster operations. Thank you. Next.
All right. The next question is posed from Richard Murphy. So I'll go ahead and open your line so you can pose your question. Richard, your line is going to open. Yes.
I have mainly a comment. After hearing the presentation and understanding that the deck is stacked against persons with disabilities, health issues, people of color, is it any wonder that we find them still not recovered even years afterwards, and we tend to blame the victim for that? That's a puzzlement, but I hate to say it, but I hadn't put it together quite that way. There's so much official requirements of people applying for aid, and people, especially immigrants, may not have the documentation, as you pointed out, and they simply can't get the help, nor renters either. So I've been through a tornado, and it took us about 3 or 4 years to quote-unquote recover, and it was these type of people that were years later that were still the problem.
Oh yeah, well, thank you for that insight. And yeah, a lot of victim blaming. I've read a book by a researcher out in San Francisco about recovery from Katrina, and she talks about how everybody's expected to be an entrepreneur after a disaster and go right out there and get that assistance. And if they don't, well, that's their fault. You know, it's another version of the laziness myth, right? People are too lazy to get aid. So I agree with you.
All right, excellent.
Well,
so we have one last.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Richard?
I'm like others, I'm going to talk to our local VOED about it.
Great idea. Also talk to your local emergency management too.
Thank you.
So let me just, if I can just elaborate on that. Emergency management has limited staff and limited budgets. And they, in part, like the rest of government, responds to where they hear from people. Kathleen mentioned earlier in her presentation about the need for Catholic Charities people to represent the interests of the populations we serve, because they are not doing it, and we really can be their voice, and as part of our leadership in community. If you make demands, they can be addressed. If there's no request going into emergency management to represent the interests of people that we care about, then there's a vacuum there.
All right, we'll move forward to the last question from Colleen Smith. So I'm now opening your line so you can pose your question.
Sure, yeah. Ask this question. Sure. Yep.
Okay. My apologies. Well, it looks like we have all the questions have been answered at this time.
Okay. So Kathleen, do you have any closing comments?
Well, I'm just so delighted to see so many of you taking part in this webinar. I really appreciate the invitation to talk with you today. I hope you'll find it useful, and check out the Natural Hazard Center website. Google Natural Hazard Center and you will find us, and you might find some things of interest on the website, including all the issues of our newsletters and of our other postings about things that are going on in disaster risk reduction and policy. So Google Natural Hazard Center, and I hope you'll find some resources there that can be of help to you. And in the meantime, I'll be on the lookout for information that I can send to Maria that she can make available to you. Again, thank you very much.
Kathleen, I just want to thank you for taking the time to do this. This has just been a really terrific webinar for us to be able to present. To our participants, I will be sending you the resources that we mentioned in terms of the 2 books, as well as I can send you the URL to the Natural Hazard Center.
Oh, great.
I want to, yes, and I can give you my highest recommendation to make yourself available, to make those resources available to you. I've been using them for years. Let me just close also, so thank you for taking the time. I see this webinar as just a part of an ongoing conversation. I encourage you to get your hands dirty in disasters, literally and figuratively. Get engaged in local emergency management, get engaged in WEVE, and if you need support in how to think about it, how to strategize, my staff is there to support you in disasters and to support you in getting ready for disasters. So get in touch and we can do a one-on-one. Let me also say that we are forming a disaster operations community of practice in the network. We did some presentations at AID this past fall to talk about what does that mean and what are we doing. I will be doing a webinar on January 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern to talk about what is a disaster operations community of practice and what do we want to do over the next 5 years. Things like creating standards, things like sharing resources are well within what we're anticipating will be what we will be doing in the community of practice. So I would encourage you to sign up if you have not done so already for the community of practice webinar. Again, my thanks, and on behalf of I and my staff, thank you, and we look forward to working with you. Take care. Bye-bye.